What's up everyone and welcome back to the channel. Alright, today you can see we have the transmission out of the M3. This is the ZF320Z, I believe, transmission. So this is going to be a two-part video. The first part is going to be going over this transmission. We're going to clean it up and replace all the seals. We're going to do the input shaft seal, the output shaft seal, selector rod seal, a couple of other things around here. And then the second video will actually be replacing the detent kit on this transmission, which is almost one of my favorite things to do. It really makes your transmission feel brand new. And with these ZF transmissions, they have an issue with fifth gear lean, or the actual shifter not auto centering back to neutral, and that fixes all of that. So I'm going to go over both those processes, but today let's clean this thing up and start changing some seals. Okay, so these are the parts we're going to be using for the refresh of this transmission. This is everything besides the detent kit that I talked about earlier. So we're going to have your input shaft seal here. This is going to be your output shaft seal. Selector rod seals in here. We're going to do a brand new throwout bearing. This is going to be your pivot fork guide tube, your pivot fork, brand new pivot pin, and joint bushing. So I talked about this in an earlier video as well, but I'm going to go over all this again today. I'm going to put all the part numbers in the description below if you want to follow along to do this. Like I said, this is for a ZF320 transmission. It comes off of E36s and E39 328i's, and it also comes off of E36 M3s. Okay, so if you're doing this on another car like an M52 or something like that with a Getrag, it might be a little bit different, but most of the stuff is pretty similar. So let's get started. Okay, to start, we're going to focus on the inside of the transmission here. So this is where all the business happens as far as engaging and disengaging the clutch. This is going to be your throwout bearing here. And anytime you do a clutch change or remove the transmission, it's a good idea to change this throwout bearing, because you never want to take off the transmission, or you want to take it off as least amount of times as possible. So if you run this bearing again and it ends up going bad, you're going to have to do all this work all over again for a, I don't know, a $30 part or so. So right away we're going to take off the throwout bearing, and if you want to know it's bad, you can twist it, and you actually, if it's bad, you'll hear kind of like rocks, or it'll just be rough feeling. It won't be very smooth. I don't know if you can pick that up on the camera, but this one looks to be pretty worn, so it's a good thing I'm changing this. I'm gonna go here. So this is your pivot fork here. Your slave cylinder will come in through here, and when you push the pedal in, the fluid transfers through the slave cylinder and it pushes the rod out, and that rod will push this pivot fork out, which then pushes this throwout bearing out and engages the pressure plate. When the pressure plate engages, it has those spring forks on it, and that gets pushed in, which releases the clutch. So that's how that kind of works. And then when you pull off the pedal, the fluid goes back, the pivot fork goes back in, and your clutch engages again, so your engine can keep spinning. So believe it or not, this pivot fork is another wear item, and I think a lot of people neglect to change this. And from BMW brand new, I think it's around $18 or so. So it's not a bad thing to replace. And I'll show you why I say that when I remove it. So this pivot fork has a spring here, and that spring is attached to your pivot pin. Now this is a plastic pin that always wears out, and sometimes, let's see, yep, see it like that one too. Sometimes they just pull out. So this is your pivot pin. So if I take this off, this pin right here rides on that little spot there. So the pivot fork pivots on this pin, is why it's called pivot pin, obviously, like that. And this wears out, and when this wears out, it actually affects your clutch pedal feel. It might engage a little higher than normal. And I'm going to get into all this just a little bit of how I feel about all of these. But these are all wear items. And the last wear item actually is this tube right here. This is your pivot fork guide tube. And this actually runs on, this pivot fork actually wears on this guide tube as well. And it wears out. And this spins in here inside of it and can wear out too. So actually BMW from the manual says that anytime you do a clutch job, you should replace your pivot pin, your pivot fork, your guide tube, and your throwout bearing, as well as the clutch, obviously, like that. So okay, so back in the transmission here. So now we're going to remove the guide tube here. The guide tube is held on by 4 bolts. They're 5mm Allen bolts. So we'll remove this. And we need to remove these to get to the input shaft seal. So this is a very common seal that goes wrong. So if you see oil dripping between the seal here of your transmission, it could be one of two things. Your output, your rear main seal on the engine, or it's going to be the input shaft seal here. This is also a pretty neglected item when you do transmissions. I don't know why, it's very easy to change. So let's just do it. So those are the 4 bolts, and this will just come off just like that. So this is your guide tube. And let me see if I can clean this a little bit. So this is your guide tube here, and BMW says this is a wear item, and you're supposed to replace this with every transmission or every clutch change. Here's your brand new one here. So people that say your guide tubes don't wear, you're wrong as well. This is a wear item, and you should go ahead and change this. I think this guide tube is only about $15 or so. Like, it's not that much money, and if you're in here already, you might as well do it. So we're going to replace that, but that's your worn guide tube. Okay, so here is the input shaft seal. The seal goes around the input shaft, obviously that's why they call it like that. You have to be careful. There is a bearing behind this input shaft seal. So there's a couple ways you can do it. You can take a screwdriver and kind of tap the edges to kind of, bring it out a little bit so you can pull it. And then also you can take a wood screw and actually drill it in just a tiny bit, but don't go very far, because like I said, there is a bearing behind there and you could actually puncture the bearing. But you can drive a wood screw just a tiny bit and then take pliers and pull it out. This thing's not in there very tough. But once we take it out, you'll see the metal, or you'll see oil come through. So this seal is important. Looking at it right now, I don't see much oil or anything dripping, so I think the seal is either newer or it's still good right now. So either way, we're here, and let's go ahead and replace the seal. So there, you can see as I just tapped one side of it with the screwdriver, I was able to pivot the seal and get it out without using the wood screw. I think this is probably a little bit better option than the wood screw, just because you don't want to puncture it. But do what you have to do. I've done it both ways. So here's the worn out seal. You can see the oil coming through. And that's the bearing that's behind the input shaft seal. So that's what I was saying, if you go too far, you can actually puncture this bearing here, and that would be pretty bad. There's no way to replace that bearing, so if you do, you gotta completely tear apart the transmission to get to it. So just don't do it. But so now that the seal's out, we'll clean it up and we'll push in the new seal, and I'll show you how that works. So here's the brand new seal. Obviously there's only one way to put it on. I guess you could put it on both ways, but this will be on the outside. And make sure you clean the seal surface very well. You don't want any oil or anything like that on there. And you're going to push this on. Very simple. just like that. Once you have it on a little bit, we'll get a soft material and we'll hammer it on. Okay, so there you go. You just want the seal flush with this housing here. And once that's all done, continue to clean it up a little bit, and we're ready to install the new fork tube. So we're going to install the new tube here. There's no right or wrong way to line this up. Put it on, make sure the holes are lined up. You're going to put the screws back in. Once the screws are in, you're going to torque these to spec. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to replace the pivot pin. Like I said, this one is actually pretty good condition, but since I have a new one, there's no point in not replacing it. Before you do that, you're going to have to replace this little retaining clip here, or spring. To do that, you just kind of push here, that'll come off, and you put the new one on, just like that. I'll clean this up a little bit. Okay, so now that we have the new pivot pin in, we need to push it into this slot. Now these are usually press fit. They're really, really tight. So like, I know I can't show this right now, but I can't push this all the way in. So let me see if I can get a better view of this. So this is where the pivot pin comes through on this side of the transmission. And you can see the pivot pin isn't actually all the way in yet, so it's not completely seated. Now, to completely seat it, you have to be careful. Don't take a hammer straight to it because you can break the pivot pin. So to seat it correctly, I like to take a 14mm deep well socket. And I'll put it right over that pivot pin. And I'll hammer it on until it's flush like that. It's very important to use the socket and not just hammer the tip, because the tip is the wear item, and if you dent that, then you have to get a new pin. It's like the same thing as a worn out pin where you're gonna have a little bit of wear there. So make sure to use the socket so it goes actually around the nipple of the pin and push that in. So now we have to replace the pivot fork, and that pivot fork goes in between that retaining clip right here. Now there's no right or wrong way to put on the pivot fork as long as the outside is on the outside. This is symmetrical, so you can do it either way like this. So you put this in here, and the retaining clip will go around here, and it will ride on that pivot fork. So, and then lastly, we're going to put the new throwout bearing in. Before I get to that, I forgot to mention when we were talking about the pivot forks, another wear item are these nubs here, and this is where the throwout bearing actually rides. So it gets pushed on that, and you can see pretty decent wear on this one compared to the new one, which has nothing. So that will affect your clutch feel as well. So the throwout bearing, there is a right and wrong way to do this. There's two flats on the throwout bearing, as you can see right there. Those flats ride on the flats here. So you don't want it like this. You're going to want the flats up and down vertically. And these areas right here will ride on these platforms here on the throwout bearing. So put that in like that, and now that's all right and good. Another good practice is to put a little bit of grease in between these flats and the pivot fork. That will just prevent a little bit of wear, just to give a little bit of lubrication there when you're using the clutch so much. So I'll do that before I put on the transmission. But after that, everything in here is completely done. Everything's new. So let's get to the back side of the transmission. So on the back side of the transmission, we're going to be replacing the output shaft seal. That's going to require a deep well 36mm socket to take this nut off and pull off the flange. And also going to be changing the selector rod seal. So this is another big issue on every transmission that I've ever had from BMW, is you'll see oil just dripping down here. Now it doesn't look too bad because I cleaned it right now, but this is your selector, and this is what changes all your gears. This little rubber seal in here wears out, and you end up getting leaks. Along with that, underneath the selector rod joint here, we're going to be replacing the selector rod joint bushing. And I went over this in another video, but this thing is so important. This will literally make your shifter feel really, really tight. It's often neglected. Some people buy a new one of these and it comes with it, so that's good. But I actually sell just the foam pieces if you need to. So let's get started on this now. To take off the selector rod joint, there's a C-clip here. So you're just going to want to pull up on that. Move it out of the way. Once you get that, you can pull off the C-clip here. And then this selector rod joint actually has a pin right here on top. And you're going to want to push that pin out. Just like that. So there's the pin. And you can pull this out. Now look at this. Okay. So this foam piece right here is what goes on in here. Now you can see how deteriorated. This is actually more intact than most of them. But let's see if I can. Look at this. This is that foam piece. I'm guessing this is original, but this is giving a lot of slop to your shifter, and just by replacing this alone, you'll have tighter, crisper, better shifts. So we'll clean this out and replace the foam piece, but first we need to replace the seal right here. Now the seal is not very easy to get out. You're gonna have to use a combination of a couple screwdrivers, picks like this. But slowly work at it. Try not to gouge the outside or the shaft because you can cause more leaks. But we need to get this seal out right here. So let's get into that. Alright, so we finally got that out. What I did is I took a screwdriver and I pushed it in. I tried to, just like the input shaft seal in the earlier video, kind of cock it. Didn't work totally well, but a pick, if you can get it in there and then stab the seal a little bit and pull it out, you should be able to get this. So now that the input shaft seal is out, here it is. And to replace it, you're going to want to clean this up as best you can. You can do this in or out of the car. I've done it in the car plenty of times. So here's the new shaft seal. Here it is right here. So as you can see, there's two parts of the shaft seal. This inner part has a spring in it. This outer part has like this little lip. And you want that spring part to go inside the transmission and the lip part to ride on the input shaft here, or the selector rod shaft. So to install this, you're gonna, like I said, put the spring side in. Go around there. And to make this a little bit easier, we're going to use that same 14mm deep well socket. Oh, never mind. And to make this a little easier, we're going to use a 16mm deep well socket, and that will go around the shaft. And that's going to go right on the edges of the seal. And you're just going to take a hammer. And you're going to hammer that on. So you want the seal again flush against the transmission case. But now we got a new transmission seal there, and it's perfect. Okay, now we're moving on to the selector rod joint here, and I already cleaned out the old bushing, that little foam piece, and you can kind of scrape it out with a little pick here, and then clean it up a little bit. Get most of it out you can. And then you're going to grab a new selector rod joint bushing, this little foam piece, and you're simply going to push this into here. And I'm telling you, if you've never done this, this is going to increase your shifter feel so much. You'd be surprised what this little bushing does, and it's very neglected. So I approve of it. It's like $3 on my website. Just go ahead and get it. But now you're gonna push this on and then push this pin back in. Because you have a new foam piece in here, it's gonna cause more resistance. So it's gonna be a little bit tougher to put on. If you're inside the car, it's a little worse, but it's all doable. I did it in my other video. But so we're gonna push this on, push the pin in, and then we'll get the C-clip back on. Okay, now that the pin's in, we'll go ahead and put the C-clip back on. Alright, now that the C-clip's back on, the new joint bushing in there, and you can already tell just how tight this is. It was really floppy before. If you've ever taken off another one, you can just kind of wiggle it around. This thing is really tight, and that's all because of that foam piece. So I really highly suggest you do that, like I said. But now let's get into the output shaft seal. Okay, so now we're going to change the output shaft seal, and to do that we have to take off the output shaft, obviously. Now there's a 36mm nut right here, so you're going to need an impact of some sorts. If you don't have an impact gun, the best way to do this is to loosen this while it's in the car. So if you have the transmission in gear, this isn't going to rotate freely. And then you can put a 36mm socket with a breaker bar on it and easily get that nut off. So just a piece of advice, if you don't have an impact, you're going to need to do that while it's on the car, so don't forget about that. So let's get this off, and then we'll need a 3-jaw puller to take off the output shaft. Now to take this off, I'm going to use a simple 3-jaw puller. Okay, so now that the output shaft flange is off, you can see the seal in there that we're going to need to remove. Okay, to remove the seal, we're going to use what we did before with a combination of a flathead screwdriver and various picks I have. Now, once again, be very careful when you're removing this. You don't want to score the inside of this, because if there's a burr or something like that, you can actually cut the seal on the new one, and you'll have more leaks as well. So let's try to get this thing out. Alright, so there we have it. It was a little more difficult to get out, actually. The picks just weren't doing it. So what I had to do is just wedge a screwdriver between the seal and the top of the case there, and then just kind of pry down, and that will deform the seal enough to remove it. So now that the seal is removed, we're going to clean out in there and then install the new seal. So whenever we're installing new seals, it's always a good idea to lubricate the seal a little bit with a little bit of motor oil. That's what I always have in these containers here. So the spring side obviously goes into the transmission, the flat side stays on the outside. Alright, so I just kind of use a brass punch there with the hammer to lightly tap it in. Once it's mostly in there, you can take your same 36mm deep well socket and send it the rest of the way. Okay, so there it is. So the same with all the seals, you just want to make it flush up against the casing there. Okay, so now that the seal is in, we can go ahead and put the flange back on. I always like to look at the flange around here, make sure there's no burrs or anything sharp, you know, that's going to cut the seal, because otherwise it'll just leak and you're going to be right back to where you were. So check out the flange a little bit, and then this is splined obviously, so there's no right or wrong way to put it on. Once it's on a little bit, you can take your 36mm socket again and hammer it until the thread shows so we can put the nut on. Okay, so now the threads are showing a little bit, so we're going to take our nut again and start threading it, and then we're going to use an impact gun to tighten it and then torque to spec. Okay, so the the output flange is back on. We have a new seal. Everything still rotates well, and we're pretty much done back here. So that's it. So that's all there is to it. We went through the whole transmission. We replaced all the seals: the input shaft seal, output shaft seal, selector rod joint seal, pivot pin, pivot fork, throwout bearing. I think that's pretty much it. The next video I'm going to be going through the detent kit for this. Scares a lot of people, I know that, but there's special tools involved, and once you kind of know how to do it, it's really not that bad. So if you're wanting to know how to do that, definitely stay tuned for the next video. Other than that, all these seals are a very good thing to do. Every BMW I've ever owned, at least 2 out of 4 or 5 of those seals are leaking all the time, so they're very cheap. If you have the transmission out, it's the best time to do it. It is possible to do some of these when it's installed in the car, so it's not that bad. But yep, that's it. So thank you for watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and please subscribe. I'll be going through the whole M3 here, and hopefully get this thing back on track in November time period. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.